Neil, you wrote a short while ago a piece for Bloomberg Opinion on the peaking of the global population and the consequence of that. I have heard from various people in and around Wall Street that has been a very influential piece. People are very concerned about that over the long run. First of all, give us the facts of where we think we are now, where we're headed in terms of population growth.
Well, David, when you and I were young, the world worried about a population bomb. There was going to be a Malthusian crisis named after the great 18th century political economist Thomas Malthus, where overpopulation would lead to famine and disaster. And it was those ideas back in the 60s and 70s that led to some pretty drastic population policies, not least the one-child policy in China. Well, fast forward to the 2020s, and it turns out that the law of unintended consequences has struck again. And we now are facing significant population declines, not only in Asian countries that drastically reduced family size, but right across the globe, except in Africa. And it looks as if, although you can debate the exact timing, humanity will peak in the 2060s. We'll get to the maximum population probably some way below the 10 billion mark. And after that, population is going to decline and decline pretty steeply. This is most easy to illustrate with the case of China, where the population is forecast to decline by half, by 50% between now and the end of the century. But it's not just a Chinese story. Ultimately, it's a global story. And this is one of these trends that I think most people haven't fully grasped, because it's just a little bit out of the average person's planning horizon, the 2060s.
So what happened? Why is it that we have, in fact, the fertility rates going down the way they are in so many countries around the world?
Well, that's not the easiest question I've been asked today, because explaining why in all kinds of different contexts, couples have chosen to reduce the number of children that they have below the replacement rate. Now, it's typically said that the average couple has to have 2.1 children. Yes, I know there's no such thing as 0.1 of a child, but just above 2 for us to maintain population, because obviously there are some people who die prematurely, perhaps even in childhood. So the replacement rate's 2.1 per couple, but all over the world, couples have taken that number down below 2. Indeed, in countries like South Korea, the fertility rate is below 1 on average. And so the one-child family has become pretty much the norm in East Asia, and it's rapidly spreading around the world. Population in the United States has continued to grow only because of immigration. It's not because of natural increase, because in the United States, as in most Western countries, the average fertility rate fell some time ago below 2.1. Now, why is that? I mean, there are all kinds of explanations that you can advance. Maybe the attitudes of women changed to family size because women began to pursue more ambitious careers in the wake of feminism. Or maybe it's just that as societies become more economically advanced, people decide to spend their resources not on having more children, but on having more vacations or acquiring yachts and McMansions. There are a bunch of different explanations at work here. I was drilling down into the South Korean case, and the answer that I got from the South Koreans I talked to was, well, it's just so expensive to raise kids in Seoul these days. We spend a fortune on educating our one kid. We just can't imagine doing it for 2. And, you know, you have to ask yourself what the rationale is for a society that invests so heavily in education that the fertility rate falls to below 1. I mean, that's a society that's going to be very highly educated until it goes extinct, which happens, you know, pretty quickly if you reduce your fertility rate down to 0.5 or 0.6.
It begs the question of what, if anything, governments through their policies can do to affect this. Obviously, we have the one-child policy in China. They're trying to change that, not so easy. But we hear, for example, in the United States, the suggestions that things like child tax credits, subsidizing, making working more flexible, may in fact encourage more births. Do we have any evidence that, in fact, those things might be effective?
Pretty much none. I mean, governments have been trying to do this since nearly 100 years ago. It was Mussolini, when he was the Italian dictator, who talked about a battle for births. And all kinds of incentives were created by the totalitarian regimes of the mid-20th century to increase the birth rate. None of it works. It would seem that once people have got down to 2 children, it's extremely hard to get them back up to 3. When they're down to 1, it's hard to get them back up to 2. So I think it's very hard to find any evidence of a successful economic policy that changes the decision making that couples make about family size. And this is a big problem if you're Xi Jinping and you're staring at this dramatic decline in population. It's already begun. I mean, the workforce is already shrinking. And so the one-child policy, which was one of the more dramatic interventions the Chinese Communist Party did back in the days of Deng Xiaoping, has been replaced by a 3-child policy. But I can assure you the number of Chinese couples I know who are planning to have 3 children is tiny. And it's highly unlikely, in my view, that China will be able to increase the fertility rate back above 2. If you assume that the fertility rate stays where it is in a country like China, then actually the population will fall even faster than 50% between now and the end of the century. And the thing that's really striking, David, is if you look beyond 2100 into the next century, what's really amazing to me is how quickly global population could decline. We shot up from 2 billion back in the early 1920s to where we are today with astonishing speed. And indeed, the last 100 years was one of those periods of population explosion. You can see why people in the 1970s started to panic about it. Well, get this, if you fix that problem so much that fertility falls well below the replacement rate, then the population of the world could fall with almost comparable speed. Certainly between now and the end of the century, nearly all the increase in population in the world is going to come from sub-Saharan Africa. And after they bring their family size down, which it's highly likely they will, there just won't be any sources of additional population. And that means the immigration option will no longer really be available for countries that want to continue to grow.
But talk about that immigration option in the interim period. What ramifications does that have? As you mentioned, the United States actually has been maintaining its population growing because of immigration. What does this mean for immigration policy in places like the United States and other Western countries?
Well, it's relatively easy if you can just get the politics right, because there's obviously a competition for talent in the world, and the talent that's in relatively poor, relatively crowded countries wants, and you can tell this from opinion polls, to come to the United States, and if it can't make it to the United States, to Western Europe or the UK. But the United States has taken the rather odd decision to make it really difficult to migrate to the United States legally. I mean, all the kind of legal channels are more or less blocked at the moment, or extremely hard to navigate. And so we've ended up with this curious strategy of allowing illegal immigration across the southern border, which is now pretty much a scene of chaos. The Canadians must be looking at this with a smile, because their immigration policy is much more targeted on attracting talent and making sure that the immigrants are likely to add to economic growth and not to be a cost of some kind. So I think for Western countries, there's an obvious argument for immigration reform that aims at attracting the right kind of people with the right kind of talents and doing it through legal channels rather than just having a free-for-all on your border. I think that's the critical issue, but we have to understand that this is not something, a gift, if you like, that will keep on giving indefinitely. Sometime around the 2060s, the supply of immigrants, of potential immigrants, is going to look like it's declining. And I think there'll become an increasingly heated competition for the people with the talent, the entrepreneurship, between countries that still want to attract immigrants. Remember, not everybody wants to do this. China does not have a policy of attracting immigrants, and relatively few, if any, people choose to migrate to the People's Republic of China. So what are the Chinese going to do? If they don't do immigration and their population is heading towards dramatic contraction, the answer may be robots. And I tried to sum up the future of the world by saying that the Cold War II challenge, the rivalry between the United States and China, may end up being immigrants v. robots.